They got married yesterday already, only inviting special people. The words fell into the quiet room like shards of glass, slicing Elizabeth Krause to the core. They struck her like a blade of ice, cold, merciless, cutting straight into flesh. For a moment she could not tell if she was standing inside her own living room or lost in a dark dream that refused to end, her eyes fixed on Clara, 32 years old, the woman who only yesterday had become the legal wife of her son Daniel. Clara's lips curved into a smile, soft and graceful on the surface, yet sharp as a hidden knife. Across the room, Daniel, 35, sat slouched with his head lowered, his fingers restless on the glowing screen of his phone. He did not meet his mother's eyes, did not offer her a word, not even a glance of comfort. Elizabeth became aware that she herself was still clutching her phone so tightly that the bones of her knuckles shone white. Numbers stormed into her thoughts with brutal clarity. $500 each month for their rent, thousands for new furniture, hundreds of grocery bags she had carried to their apartment, weighed down with food she often denied herself. For 3 long years she had poured every remaining cent of her pension and the savings left behind by her late husband into Daniel and Clara's comfort. And now, on the most important day of her son's life, she, his only mother, had been erased from the picture, excluded like a stranger who meant nothing. In her wardrobe at home, the pale pink dress still hung untouched. She had chosen it carefully, smoothing every crease, dreaming of standing proudly beside her son in photographs of the wedding day. The new shoes, still shining in their box, had never touched the ground. Now they were reduced to mute witnesses of a cruel truth. Every preparation, every fragile dream of joy and togetherness had been obliterated by 4 poisonous words: special people only. Clara sat comfortably on the sofa, the same sofa Elizabeth had bought with her own money. She crossed her legs, her posture carrying the insolence of someone celebrating a triumph. Elizabeth could hear her own heart pounding violently, each beat like a hammer crashing against her ribs. Daniel stayed silent, the boy she had once cradled in her arms, the child she had comforted through every nightmare, now sitting bowed before his wife, leaving his mother frozen in humiliation. The air in the room grew thick, suffocating. The clock ticked heavily on the wall, every sound like a nail being hammered into her awareness. Elizabeth swallowed hard, trying to summon her voice, but her throat had dried as though clutched by invisible hands. She longed to ask, "Do you remember who raised you? Do you remember who kept this house alive?" But her lips remained stiff, locked, and only her eyes, red and glistening, bored into the face of her only son. Memories surged without mercy. 35 years earlier, on the day Daniel was born, Elizabeth had stood before her late husband's photograph and sworn that she would raise their child to be a good man. She had surrendered her chance for an easy retirement, abandoned her dream of traveling the world, and lived frugally so that Daniel could have the best. Every cheap can of beans and every bag of rice on her table had been transformed into fine meals in Daniel's refrigerator, and now, in his silence, he had become an accomplice to the greatest humiliation of her life. Clara tilted her head, her voice soft, almost gentle but sharp as a blade. It was a small wedding, mother, intimate, just a few people, and of course the special ones. Each word dripped like poison into Elizabeth's ears, pressing down on her chest. Still, she did not cry. Her tears had dried. In their place, a fire began to burn. It was the fire of anger, the fire of pride trampled and ground underfoot. For the first time in many years, she felt blood rushing hot through her veins, not the frail blood of an old woman, but the fierce blood of a woman who had once commanded a household, who had carried burdens and steered her life with iron strength. Clara expected her to collapse, to beg, to kneel. Daniel expected her to endure in silence, as always. But they had forgotten the truth. Every meal they ate, every piece of furniture they used. Every single dollar they spent had been built upon Elizabeth's labor and sacrifice. They thought she was weak. They thought her power had faded. But in truth, she was the one who held the real power. Inside her, a vow began to thunder. I was cast aside on my son's wedding day, but this will not be the end. I will be the one to decide how this story ends. Elizabeth lifted her head slowly. Her eyes, lined with the marks of age, now gleamed with steel. They were no longer the eyes of a woman beaten down, but the eyes of someone humiliated and ready to turn the board upside down. The room was still heavy, the silence still pressing. Yet for Elizabeth, it no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a beginning. The wound of this day was the spark, and the fire that now blazed inside her would not die until the truth was revealed, until those who had treated her like nothing more than an emotional ATM were brought low, forced to kneel before the true power of the mother they had scorned. That night, Elizabeth Krause sat alone in her silent kitchen. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, but to her each sound felt like mockery, a cruel reminder of how much time she had wasted. In front of her sat a cup of tea, long gone cold, its flat taste matching the emptiness inside her. She tried to close her eyes, but memories of the past 3 years surged back, one after another, vivid and merciless, as if they had all happened yesterday. 3 years, just that short span of time, yet to Elizabeth it stretched longer than an entire lifetime. Since the day Daniel moved in with Clara, her entire world had been reduced to a single duty: providing. Each month she withdrew money from her pension and the modest savings left by her late husband, sending exactly $500 to cover her son's rent. The number became so routine that the bank clerks recognized her name on the transfer list, but rent was only the beginning. Whenever Daniel's fridge was empty, Clara would call. Her voice always dripped with honey. "Mother, I've been so busy, we haven't had time to shop." If you could, Elizabeth never even let her finish. She would grab her basket and rush to the store, choosing the finest items, sometimes things she herself had never once tasted. Golden roasted chicken, imported cheese, fresh fruit glistening with dew. She pushed the cart to the counter, her heart swelling with what she thought was happiness, the belief that her son would eat well, that her sacrifice meant he was safe and cared for. Daniel's apartment had once been bare, its walls stained, its sofa ripped, nothing welcoming. Within months, thanks to Elizabeth's money, it became a cozy, well-furnished home. A new sofa, a shining dining table, a giant flat-screen TV larger than the one in her own living room. Clara would beam with pride, showing it off to her friends. "We just bought new furniture," she would brag, while Elizabeth sat quietly in the corner. No one acknowledged her, yet she felt no anger then, only pride, convincing herself she was helping her son build a future. But every time Elizabeth opened her wallet, she had to cut away pieces of her own life. Her meals were stripped down to rice with beans and boiled vegetables. Some weeks she lived on the same handful of cheap dishes again and again. She once loved reading, but stopped buying books, saving every dollar for Daniel. She once dreamed of traveling to Europe, of walking under golden autumn leaves, but year after year, her savings disappeared into Daniel's bills. On lonely nights, she sat at her worn kitchen table and opened her account book. Numbers lined the pages in long, relentless columns. Rent, $500 a month, 36 months, $18,000. Food and household items, $200 a month. $7,200 in total. Birthday gifts, Christmas presents, anniversary tokens, at least $3,000. Emergency medical treatment for Clara, $800. Repairs for the car, the refrigerator, the air conditioner, more than $3,000. When she added them all, the number glared back at her, over $33,000. enough to live comfortably for years, enough to realize her dreams, enough to let her grow old in peace. Instead, it had all vanished, traded for Clara's shallow smiles and Daniel's cold nods. The realization tightened her throat. She had allowed herself to become a shadow. For years, she walked on eggshells, cautious with every word and gesture, desperate not to make Daniel and Clara feel burdened. She had bent herself in every direction just to be accepted, just to hear one simple word, family. Yet yesterday they had stripped that title from her with one cruel sentence, only special people are invited. Her mind replayed Daniel's eyes from long ago, the bright gaze of a boy who once hugged her neck and whispered, "Mom, you're the best." Where was that boy now? All that remained was a grown man, cold and distant, treating his mother like a walking wallet. Elizabeth pressed her head into her hands, lost in a maze of grief. Her chest ached, but within that ache something unfamiliar began to stir. It was not despair. It was a spark, faint but alive. The first light of realization. She had wasted too many years trying to buy a love that had never truly existed. Clara and Daniel believed she was weak, believed she could not survive without clinging to them. But the truth was the opposite. They could not survive without clinging to her. Every meal, every room, every comfort in their lives bore her imprint. And what if one day that hand withdrew? What if the constant stream of money and support suddenly ended? Elizabeth let out a bitter smile. Perhaps it was time they learned how to stand on their own 2 feet, time they faced the world without leaning on her sacrifices. She had given them everything, and they had given her nothing but humiliation. The night dragged on, the tea on the table remained untouched, but Elizabeth's eyes had changed. The pain was still there, sharp as ever, yet beneath it burned something stronger. The fire of a mother who had been scorned, the fire of a 70-year-old woman ready to rise again, and that fire spread through her, warming her bones, whispering promises. It told her that one day soon she would break free completely, that the chains which had bound her for far too long would be burned to ash. 1 week after the shock of the wedding, the phone rang in Elizabeth Cruse's living room, its shrill sound slicing through the heavy silence that had become her companion. She turned her head and looked at the glowing screen. The name appeared, Clara. For a brief moment, Elizabeth hesitated. A part of her, that stubborn old habit, urged her to pick it up immediately. For years she had been trained to answer, to respond without delay whenever Clara called. It did not matter whether the request was trivial, such as running out of detergent, or urgent, such as rent due the next morning. Elizabeth had always been the one to fix, to rescue, to provide. But today her hand felt impossibly heavy. She let the ringing continue, allowed the sound to pierce the room several times before slowly pressing the button. "Renate," Clara's voice came through the receiver, shaky and stripped of its usual arrogance. "This month's rent hasn't gone through. The landlord is threatening to evict us. You must have forgotten, right? He said if it isn't paid this week, we will lose the place." Clara tried to lace her words with calmness, but panic bled into every syllable. Elizabeth closed her eyes, her chest rising slowly as she listened to her own heart. The rhythm carried her back, dragging her through years of repetition. She remembered the evenings she abandoned her half-eaten dinner, rushing to the bank before closing time. She remembered the mornings she canceled shopping trips for herself just to make sure Daniel and Clara had a roof over their heads. She remembered weeks of eating cold leftovers, wearing faded sweaters and shoes with worn soles, because she believed her son's comfort mattered more than her own survival. But today, what rose inside her chest was not pity, not obligation. It was something far clearer, a vision cutting through the fog of old habits. It was clarity. She lifted the phone closer to her lips, her voice startling even herself with its steadiness. "Clara, Wasn't it you who said I wasn't special enough to attend the wedding? On the other end came silence. Elizabeth could almost hear Clara freeze. Then a sharp inhale rattled across the line, as if Clara had swallowed shards of glass. I remember very clearly, Elizabeth continued, her tone crisp, her words deliberate. You said only special people were invited. So remember that now, because I too will only help those who are truly special. The silence deepened, heavy and suffocating. Elizabeth could hear her own heart, the relentless ticking of the wall clock, and the quickened, uneven breaths of her daughter-in-law. Renate, what are you saying? Clara stammered at last, her voice wobbling, shifting from pleading to anger. We've always been special to you. You've always treated me like a second mother. Elizabeth let out a bitter laugh. The words that once might have softened her now rang hollow, like an old trick played too many times. She realized those sweet declarations were only ever spoken when money was required. On ordinary days, Clara never even thought to ask about her health, never once came by simply to share a cup of tea. Elizabeth, Clara tried again, softening her voice into a sugary plea. I know you're upset about the wedding, but it was all a misunderstanding. Please help us now. If you don't, we will lose everything. No, Elizabeth cut in firmly, her voice ringing with an authority that even startled her own ears. You are not losing everything. You still have your youth, your health, and two capable hands. The only thing you are losing is the habit of depending on me. On the line, Clara was stunned into silence. For a fleeting moment, Elizabeth imagined she could hear the fragile wall of pride in her daughter-in-law cracking, pieces tumbling down. Daniel will call you, Clara blurted suddenly, her voice breaking apart. He will explain. You can't do this. You owe us. Elizabeth's reply came sharp, final. I owe no one. In the last 3 years, I have given more than $30,000. That was never a debt. That was a gift. And now, the gifts are gone. With that, she pressed the button and ended the call. Silence swept back into the room like a tide. Elizabeth lowered herself into a chair, her hand trembling slightly. But her heart felt lighter than it had in years. It was as if she had stepped through an invisible doorway, crossing from the world of passivity into one of strength, from being disregarded to reclaiming her voice. The phone lit up again and again. Daniel, then Clara, then Daniel once more. Elizabeth glanced at the screen but did not move. Each unanswered ring was no longer a burden. It was confirmation, proof of her change. She rose slowly and walked to the dining table. Once, this table had been the altar of sacrifice, the place where she bent over late at night calculating how much she could spare for them. Today, it would be the place she began calculating for herself. She pulled open the drawer, took out her old ledger, a pen, and a fresh sheet of paper. Each figure she wrote down was like a tolling bell. $18,000 for rent, $7,200 for groceries, $3,000 for gifts, $800 for medical emergencies, $4,400 for various repairs, a total of $33,400. A staggering sum, enough to have rebuilt her life several times over. Elizabeth touched the page lightly, whispering under her breath, Enough. More than enough. Tears welled in her eyes, slid down her cheeks. But they did not sting. They were not the tears of grief anymore, but the tears of release. She realized she had lived too long inside a cycle of buying affection, mistaking obligation for love. Now, for the very first time in decades, she chose differently. She chose to live for herself. Outside, dusk had already descended. The last streaks of sunlight painted the horizon a fiery red, as though the sky itself announced a new era. Elizabeth stepped to the window, gazing into the distance, her heart unburdened. Inside her home, silence lingered once more, but this silence no longer carried the weight of loneliness. Instead, it carried the shape of freedom. The next morning, Elizabeth Krause stirred awake as the first rays of sunlight slipped timidly through the curtains and painted her walls with a pale glow. She rose slowly, her body heavy from a night without rest, her eyes still swollen from tears that had refused to fall. Yet within her chest, something had shifted. The suffocating weight of a mother betrayed was no longer crushing her shoulders. Instead, she felt strangely lighter, as if she had finally set down the massive suitcase she had been dragging across her back for decades. She wrapped herself in a worn robe and stepped into the kitchen. Every cup and plate on the shelves seemed to whisper fragments of the past. She brewed a pot of strong black coffee, the aroma rising and filling the quiet space like a promise of strength. For the first time in years, she drank her coffee without switching on her phone, without waiting for a message from Daniel, without fearing a desperate call from Clara. She sat at the table, inhaled deeply, and took measured sips, savoring the sharp bitterness that strangely tasted like peace. The dining table still bore the scratches of pens from endless evenings of calculations, checks, and transfers written for her children. But today she resolved that the figures would no longer belong to them. They would belong to her. She pulled open the drawer, removed her old ledger crowded with fading numbers, and laid a clean pad of paper beside it with a pen neatly aligned. Elizabeth began adding everything again, line by line, her hand steady despite the pounding of her heart. Rent, $500 a month, 36 months, $18,000 in total. Food and household items, $200 a month, $7,200 in total. Birthdays, Christmas, anniversaries, at least $3,000. Clara's emergency medical visit, $800. Car repairs, air conditioner replacement, new furniture, $4,400. Her pen stopped as she exhaled, staring at the sum glaring back at her, $33,400. Her heart clenched, not from regret of the money itself, but from the sudden comprehension of what it truly represented. That figure was not simply dollars, it was years of her life. It was the sweat of her youth, the silent meals she had endured, the long nights of fear, the precious dreams she had quietly buried. With that money, she could have crossed the ocean and walked under the golden leaves of a European autumn. She could have renovated her small house into a warm and safe haven. She could have lived in comfort through her old age without fear of bills or debts. But instead, every cent had been siphoned away to keep two grown adults in ease, adults who never once saw her as a human being. To them, she had become nothing but a walking wallet. Elizabeth laughed suddenly, a sharp, bitter sound that startled even herself. The laugh etched lines deeper across her face, but in her eyes it brought a glimmer of steel. She wondered aloud, all these years, what had she been living for? Was every sacrifice truly worth it, only to be repaid with 4 cruel words? Not special enough? The truth lay clear before her now. Her son and daughter-in-law believed she could not live without them, but the reality was the opposite. They could not survive without her. Every meal on their table, every piece of furniture they flaunted, every moment of comfort bore her fingerprint. And if that hand withdrew, if she chose to stop, then the glittering life they paraded would collapse in an instant. She closed the ledger with a firm motion and stood. Her eyes wandered to the old handbag resting on the chair. The decision rose like a flame inside her. She would go to the bank. Today, she would end the transfers. Today, she would break the chain that had shackled her for 3 endless years. The bank was only a few streets away. Elizabeth walked slowly along the paved sidewalk, the cool morning breeze brushing her cheeks and sharpening her thoughts. People hurried past her carrying briefcases, chasing buses, each one moving with purpose. She realized with a sudden ache that for years she had lived without her own purpose, existing only to provide for her children. But today, at 70 years old, she was beginning a new journey, the journey of living for herself. The glass doors slid open, and cool air conditioning swept against her skin. The security guard greeted her with a small bow. Elizabeth walked straight to the counter, her head high, and after a few minutes she was ushered into the office of Mr. Meyer, the branch manager. "Mrs. Krause," he greeted warmly, "you are here to continue the transfers for your son and daughter-in-law as usual?" Elizabeth looked him directly in the eyes. Her tone was clear, her words solid as stone. "No. I want them all canceled, and I want every access to my account locked. From now on, only I will touch my money." Mr. Meyer blinked, momentarily surprised. "Are you certain? For 3 years, those transfers have been as regular as sunrise. Has something happened?" Elizabeth closed her eyes briefly, gathering strength, and when she opened them again, her gaze was brighter, harder, filled with conviction. "What happened is not important. What matters is that I have finally opened my eyes." Mr. Meyer studied her for a moment, then nodded. Without further questions, he slid the forms across the desk. Elizabeth took the pen and, with a hand steady as iron, signed her name on the final line. At that moment, she felt something snap, as if an invisible cord had been cut, releasing her. A great weight lifted from her shoulders. Leaving the bank, her steps were lighter than they had been in years. She tilted her face up toward the wide blue sky and drew in a long, deep breath. For the first time in many years, Elizabeth Krause felt free. That evening, as dusk folded across the sky, she sat at her dining table again, but this time she opened a new blank notebook. Her pen did not trace Daniel's name, nor Clara's. Instead, she wrote her own list: the art course she once abandoned, the trip to Italy she had always dreamed of, a small fund to support elderly people in need. With each line, her heart grew warmer, her spirit steadier. She whispered softly to herself, words of both promise and revelation. This life is not over. It is only just beginning. Laughter slashed through the room like a knife. Why is she still alive? A woman's voice rose, light in tone, yet sharp enough to shred Evelyn Parker's dignity. She stood just outside the doorway, her hands gripping a tray of freshly baked peach tarts, their warm sweetness still drifting into the air. Her body stiffened, frozen by the cruelty of the words, but her feet moved forward anyway, carrying her into the room as though she had heard nothing. Inside, golden light poured over the family gathered around the table. Melissa, her daughter-in-law, started when she saw Evelyn, then pressed her lips into a tight, polite smile. "Oh, Mother, you came. None of us expected that." Evelyn nodded quietly and placed the tray down. No one reached for it. She pulled out a folding chair at the far end of the table, sat down with her back perfectly straight, her eyes wandering slowly around the room. Daniel, her son, raised his beer and declared loudly, "To family!" Glasses clinked together in the warm glow of laughter, but not a single pair of eyes turned toward her. Her grandchildren raced around the room, their clothes flaring as they ran, not once calling her Grandma. Evelyn's mind drifted back to the days when their tiny hands clung tightly to hers each time they crossed the street. She gave a faint smile, bitter and resigned. Perhaps they had already forgotten. Melissa came over, crouched slightly, her forced grin stretched thin. "Would you like something to eat, Mother?" Evelyn shook her head. Melissa spun away quickly, relieved, as though she had set down a heavy weight. Evelyn stayed until the very end of the meal, gathering plates, wiping the table, folding chairs. Nobody thanked her, nobody noticed. When the lights dimmed, she lifted the empty tray and walked out into the night without a sound. The next morning, her kitchen lay in silence. Evelyn poured coffee into her chipped porcelain cup and sat at the same table where Daniel had once done his homework. She saw the memory clearly, the thin boy with messy hair, glancing up to ask her questions about fractions. That boy had grown into a man who now tolerated his mother only as a ghost in the background. Evelyn sighed and opened the cabinet of files. Inside, documents lay neatly stacked. One folder cut into her heart, the house Daniel now lived in. She had given $40,000 from her pension for the down payment, yet the deed bore only his name. Not a single line acknowledged her sacrifice. The ache in her chest spread, but she did not fall. She reached for her phone and called Gloria, an old friend who had once worked in a law office. That afternoon in Gloria's home scented with lemon and mint, her friend read the papers carefully, then looked up with solemn eyes. "You gave it all away, Evelyn. The house is theirs. But," she paused, "you can still take control of what remains. Your accounts, your will, your power of attorney. Do not think of yourself as powerless." Evelyn gripped the notes Gloria handed her, and for the first time in many years, her eyes burned with clarity. That night, she sat alone in the kitchen. No music, no television, only silence. She took a sheet of paper, wrote Daniel Parker's name in shaky letters, then drew a firm black line straight through it. The next day, she changed the locks on her door. The young locksmith asked no questions, only bowed politely. Evelyn held the new keys in her palm, the metal cold, solid, reassuring. That night, she slept in peace, no longer waiting for the phone to ring, no longer feeding the hopeless dream of reconciliation. When Daniel arrived, he knocked urgently, his voice strained. "Mother, why did you do this? I never meant anything by it." Evelyn sat in the living room, watching his shadow move across the frosted glass. She did not open the door, did not speak, because she had learned that silence could carry more weight than 1,000 words of reproach. Later, a message from Melissa appeared on her phone. "We never meant to hurt you. Please don't take it to heart." Evelyn smiled faintly, pressed delete, and let it vanish. She would no longer preserve empty excuses as though they were treasures. Late that evening, Ruby, her 16-year-old granddaughter, called with a trembling voice. "Grandma, are you still angry with me? That day at the library, I pretended not to see you." Evelyn stayed quiet for a long while. Inside her heart, the frozen river cracked slightly. "Do you want to see me, Ruby?" she asked. "Just you, no one else." On the other end, Ruby exhaled in relief. "I will come." When Ruby arrived, her oversized hoodie draped around her frame, her eyes swollen, she sat with Evelyn in the kitchen eating slices of banana bread. Ruby whispered, "I copied how my parents treated you. I was wrong." Evelyn did not rush to embrace her, did not erase the guilt with blind indulgence as she might once have done. She only nodded. "If you want to return, come with truth. Do not pretend." Ruby's tears glistened as she nodded in agreement. That night, Evelyn opened her safe. Inside lay new documents freshly signed, her will, her power of attorney, a trust. Every page had been revised. Daniel, her only son, was erased. In his place, written neatly, was the name Greenway Women's Shelter, the very place that had once saved her when she was young. Every asset would go there. The shock awaiting her family still lay in the future, but in that moment, Evelyn felt her spine straighten and her gaze sharpen. This story did not end with Daniel's pounding on the door or with her silent tears. It ended with a truth louder than any accusation. The woman once treated as invisible now held every thread of power in her own hands. She had chosen, and this time the choice was not for them, but entirely, unshakably, for herself. That moment when the door slammed shut behind Daniel, Clara, and lawyer Vogel, Elizabeth Krause remained still in her living room. The house fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the steady ticking of the clock on the wall. She placed her hand over her chest, feeling her heart racing beneath her palm. But there was no fear left inside her. What spread through her veins was freedom. After years of being bound, manipulated and silenced, she had finally reclaimed her voice within the walls of her own home. The very next morning, Elizabeth called a locksmith. The sound of drilling echoed through the old house, grinding against the plaster, tearing apart invisible chains that had held her prisoner for too long. When the locksmith handed her a brand new set of keys, she closed her fingers around them tightly, her eyes glowing with fresh resolve. From this day forward, she thought, only I will have the right to enter this home. She did not stop there. She hired Felix, a young technician with a warm smile, to install a security system. He worked diligently, climbing ladders, attaching cameras to every corner. You can view everything directly from your phone, Felix explained patiently. If anyone attempts to break in, the police will be notified at once. Elizabeth nodded, a rush of relief filling her chest as though she could finally breathe again. By evening, she sat in her kitchen with a cup of tea. Her phone rested silently on the table. No desperate calls, no pleading messages, no guilt-laden interruptions. She had blocked Daniel and Clara's numbers. The peace was so complete that she could hear sparrows chirping in the garden. The kind of delicate sounds she had forgotten existed. It had been years since she had enjoyed such profound silence. Later that afternoon came a knock at the door. Elizabeth tensed, her breath caught. But when she checked the camera, it was not Daniel or Clara. On the screen stood an older woman with kind eyes and a basket of flowers in her arms. Elizabeth opened the door cautiously. The woman smiled warmly. "Hello, I am Helena Bauer. I live next door. Yesterday I heard shouting from your home. I was worried, so I came to see if you were all right." Elizabeth was surprised. For 3 years she had been so consumed by Daniel and Clara's demands that she had barely spoken to her neighbors. She invited Helena inside, poured tea, and the two women sat together as golden sunlight streamed through the window. For the first time in years, Elizabeth opened up completely. She spoke of the secret wedding, of Clara's cutting words, of the $33,400 drained from her savings, and of Lawyer Vogel's attempt to strip her freedom. With every sentence she spoke, it felt as though a weight was lifting off her chest. Helena listened intently, her eyes steady. When Elizabeth finished, Helena reached across the table, held her hand gently, and said, "I understand. 5 years ago, my own daughter treated me the same way. I paid her rent, covered her debts, even sold my jewelry. She only called when she wanted money. One day, I stopped. At first, she was furious. She threatened. She tried to break me. But she had no choice except to stand on her own feet. Now, for the first time, we have a real bond, one not built on money, but on honesty." Tears filled Elizabeth's eyes. She realized she was not alone. Other mothers had endured the same wounds, had chosen to stand firm, and had survived. Warmth spread inside her. A flame of certainty that her decision had been the right one. That night she lay awake, not from worry, but from thought. She thought of Helena and the story she had shared. She thought of the things she had long denied herself, the painting class she abandoned, the dream trip to Italy in autumn, the books she had stopped buying. For the first time in years, she was not thinking of Daniel's rent or Clara's endless wants. She was thinking of herself, and a small smile curved across her lips in the dark. The next day, Elizabeth walked to the salon she had avoided for so long. The hairdresser, Cynthia, gasped aloud. "Mrs. Krause, I thought you had moved away. It has been ages." Elizabeth smiled gently. "No, I just forgot that I deserve care too." In the mirror, she watched her reflection transform. Her silver hair was trimmed neatly, brushed into soft waves that framed her face. When Cynthia finished, Elizabeth barely recognized the woman staring back. The wrinkles were still there, but her eyes glowed with pride. Cynthia clapped her hands together. "You look wonderful. Not only your hair, but your whole presence is different." Elizabeth touched her hair with trembling fingers and whispered, "Perhaps it's because, for the first time in years, I don't feel invisible anymore." On her way home, she stopped at the bookstore. She had not bought a book in years, convincing herself that every dollar belonged to her son. Today, she picked up a thick historical novel and a beginner's guide to painting. Carrying the bag out of the shop, she felt her heart beating quickly, like a girl buying her very first gift for herself. That evening, Elizabeth sat at her table and opened her new book. Outside, night birds chirped softly in the garden. She lifted her head and realized she was smiling. The house no longer felt like a cage of sorrow, but a place of beginnings. The new locks, the cameras, the haircut, the fresh books, all stood as proof of a quiet declaration. She was remaking her life. Elizabeth knew Daniel and Clara would return, perhaps with harsher schemes, perhaps with new tricks. But she was no longer the weak mother who gave endlessly without question. She had found strength in freedom, comfort in friendship, and most importantly, she had found herself again. Early one Monday morning, Elizabeth Krause had just poured steaming water into a teapot when a sharp knock echoed against her front door. The sound rang out with an urgency that made her heart lurch. She turned toward the small screen of her newly installed security system and saw a young woman standing outside in a tailored coat, a leather briefcase in hand. On her chest gleamed a badge, Anna Schmidt, social worker. A chill crept along Elizabeth's spine, a whisper of dread rising slowly through her body. She steadied her breath, straightened her back, and opened the door, forcing her voice to remain calm. "Good morning, Mrs. Krause," the visitor said with practiced politeness, her voice carrying the careful cadence of someone used to delicate situations. "I am from the Office of Elder Services. We have received a report that you have been displaying unusual behavior that may endanger your own safety. I am here today to conduct a welfare check." Elizabeth froze in place. Her body stiffened, her breath caught, but her mind needed no time to identify the source of this intrusion. She knew at once. Daniel and Clara. They had already drained her savings, begged, manipulated, and coerced. Now they had taken their cruelty to the next level, using the law itself as a weapon against her. "Come inside," she replied coolly, her tone sharp as glass. "But first, I will call my lawyer." The young woman, Anna Schmidt, according to the badge gleaming on her chest, offered a courteous smile, though her eyes betrayed discomfort. "Of course you have that right. This is only a routine procedure. If you have nothing to hide, answering a few questions should be no problem." The phrase pierced Elizabeth like a blade. Nothing to hide. She had heard those exact words too many times, usually spilling from Clara's lips just before demanding to know account balances or pressing her into making another transfer. Elizabeth's lips tightened. Without a word, she reached for her phone and dialed Herr Schneider, the one attorney she had always trusted. Within 20 minutes he arrived, his arms weighed down by a thick folder of documents. Schneider placed the folder on the table and sat directly across from Anna. His voice was steady, deliberate, commanding. "Do you have a court order?" Anna faltered just slightly. "This is administrative, not judicial. No order is required." With deliberate force, Schneider pushed the folder forward. "My client has been financially exploited by her son and daughter-in-law for 3 long years. The total exceeds $33,000. They previously brought a lawyer to this very home to pressure her into signing a power of attorney. Now they have escalated again, reporting her as incompetent. I hold here all the evidence necessary to prove this is a calculated attempt to seize her assets." Anna shifted uncomfortably in her chair. She opened the folder, her eyes scanning the contents. Bank statements highlighting transfer after transfer, screenshots of pleading and manipulative messages, independent medical reports stamped and signed. The further she read, the heavier her expression became. Elizabeth sat utterly still, her hands pressed tightly together in her lap, her eyes unwavering, watching every flicker of reaction across Anna's face. Finally, Anna spoke, her voice quieter than before. "Mrs. Krause, can you explain why you suddenly stopped providing financial support for your son?" Elizabeth answered instantly, her words deliberate and sharp, each one falling like the blow of a hammer. "Because I realize they do not love me. They only love my money. Because I refuse to spend my pension feeding two able-bodied adults. Because I am clear-minded enough to understand that love cannot be purchased." Anna swallowed, then pressed forward. "The report claims you refused medical treatment, that you isolated yourself, that you behaved with paranoia. It states you installed excessive cameras, blocked family contact, and expressed distrust toward your neighbors." Elizabeth let out a dry laugh, the sound echoing like a crack across the room. "I installed cameras because they once tried to invade my home. I blocked their calls because I will no longer be harassed. I still do my own shopping, I tend my garden, I cook my meals, I drive my car. That is not paranoia, that is protection." Schneider added with quiet authority, his tone edged with certainty. "My client recently completed an independent psychological evaluation. The results confirm she is entirely competent. Her memory and her reasoning are above average for her age of 70. He slid the report across the table toward Anna. A heavy silence fell. Anna read slowly, carefully, page by page. At last she lifted her gaze, her voice softened, stripped of the earlier formality. "I see no evidence that you require guardianship. I will make sure this is noted clearly in my report. The claims made by your family contain contradictions." Elizabeth met her eyes, calm but proud, her words measured. "You see now, I am not a senile woman. I am a mother betrayed by her own blood. If anyone should be investigated, it is Daniel and Clara." Anna quietly closed the folder, gathered her documents, and promised she would close the case. She rose, thanked them both, and left. When the door shut, Elizabeth collapsed into her chair. Her body trembled, her muscles finally loosening after hours of rigid defense. She had stood her ground and defended herself, but she knew deep inside that this was only the beginning. Daniel and Clara had escalated once. They would not hesitate to escalate again. That evening, Helena Bauer knocked gently on her door. When Elizabeth opened it, her neighbor's face radiated concern. Inside the living room, Elizabeth recounted everything, her voice breaking as she relived the confrontation. The secret report, the accusations of madness, the humiliating scrutiny. Helena reached for her hand, squeezing it tightly. Her voice was firm. "They are desperate, and desperate people can be dangerous. But you are not alone, Elizabeth. You have your lawyer, you have me, and most importantly, you have yourself." Tears shimmered in Elizabeth's eyes, catching the light like broken glass. She nodded, realizing a truth she had not admitted before. This battle was no longer about money. It was about dignity, about freedom, about the respect she had been denied for too long. She understood she could not retreat now. She had crossed a threshold, and there was no turning back. Outside, night descended softly. The wind whispered through the trees, brushing against the windows. Elizabeth stood at the threshold, gazing into the darkness beyond her garden. Her lips pressed together, firm with resolve. The greatest battle was still ahead, but this time, she was ready to fight. On the morning of the trial, Elizabeth Krauss dressed carefully in a simple yet immaculate black suit. She stood before the mirror for a long time, staring at her reflection. The wrinkles carved by years of sacrifice remained, but her eyes gleamed brighter than they had in decades. She told herself silently that today was not only about her mind being tested. Today she would prove that her dignity, her freedom, and her entire life could not be stolen by the greed of her own flesh and blood. The courtroom was already full when she entered. Wooden benches creaked beneath the weight of neighbors, reporters, and curious onlookers. On one side sat Daniel, his suit stiff and new, his face arranged into an expression of anxious filial concern. Beside him, Clara wore a black dress, her hair pulled into a neat bun, her face carefully painted with false sorrow. They held hands like a picture-perfect couple. Pretending to worry for a misguided mother, hoping the performance would sway the judge. Their lawyer, Vogel, rose first, his voice booming across the chamber. "Your Honor, we have clear evidence that Mrs. Krause has suffered cognitive decline. She abruptly stopped financial support to her family, installed excessive security systems, and isolated herself from relatives. These are classic signs of paranoia. The family wishes only to protect her." Elizabeth listened, her chest aching. 3 years of sacrifice, every dollar, every meal missed, every dream postponed, now twisted into symptoms of illness. Yet she sat tall, her back straight, her chin lifted, refusing to bow. Schneider, her attorney, stood with calm authority. "Your Honor, my client gave more than $33,000 to her son and daughter-in-law over 3 years. She is not declining. She has awakened. She refuses to be exploited further. We submit medical reports proving she is entirely competent." Vogel called Clara to the stand first. Clara walked with calculated steps, tears shimmering in her eyes. "She was once like a second mother to me," she said, her voice trembling just enough to sound sincere. "But lately she has changed. She suspects us, speaks cruelly, blocked our calls, and filled her home with cameras like a prison. It breaks our hearts." The gallery murmured, some shaking their heads. Clara lowered her eyes, dabbing them with a handkerchief. But when Schneider rose to cross-examine, her mask cracked. "Mrs. Bauer," he began, his tone precise, "when was the last time you called Mrs. Krause simply to ask about her health, without asking for money?" Clara hesitated, her lips parting. I don't recall." "Is it true," Schneider pressed, "that you told her the wedding was only for special people, implying she was not invited?" Clara's face burned red. "That was misinterpreted. Then explain its true meaning here." "Under oath." Clara's mouth opened, then closed. Tears slid down her cheeks, but the room had turned. No one believed her sorrow. Next, Daniel was called. He shifted nervously in his chair before stepping to the stand. "My mother has always been generous," he began, his voice shaking. "But lately she behaves strangely, influenced by outsiders. I only want to protect her from herself." Schneider advanced a step, eyes steady. "Mr. Krause, can you state the exact amount your mother gave you in 3 years?" Daniel faltered. "Don't remember. Was it $33,400? Daniel lowered his head. "Perhaps." "And during those 3 years, did you ever once visit your mother without asking for money?" Daniel's throat worked, but no sound came. The courtroom was silent, the weight of his failure heavy in the air. Another witness, Mr. Davis, a stern neighbor, claimed Elizabeth acted oddly, but under questioning, he admitted he had only ever watched from afar, never spoken to her directly. His testimony collapsed into irrelevance. Vogel, desperate, called Dr. Lehman, who once suggested Elizabeth's refusal of psychiatric evaluation was a sign of decline. But Schneider calmly produced a report from Dr. Moore, an independent expert. The findings confirmed Elizabeth's mental clarity and reasoning were above average for her age of 70. Each page was read aloud, and the silence of the room deepened with every word. Finally, Schneider turned to Elizabeth. "Mrs. Krause, please take the stand." She rose slowly, every step deliberate, and placed her hand on the railing, her eyes fixed on the judge, her voice steady, clear, carrying across the room. "I raised my son with all my strength. After my husband died, I worked alone, saving every coin. Over the past 3 years, I gave more than $33,000 to my son and his wife. That was not duty. It was love. And in return, I was excluded from their wedding, told I was not special. When I stopped the payments, they brought a lawyer to my home, then accused me of madness. I am not insane. I am simply refusing to remain a victim." The room was hushed. She paused, drew a breath, and her words rang like a bell. "I do not regret loving, but I regret waiting so long to protect myself. Today I ask this court for one thing only, the right to control my own life." Vogel attempted to argue, but his voice wavered. the weight of evidence crushing the performance. The facade Daniel and Clara had built stood naked, stripped away. Judge Miller sat in long contemplation, his fingers steepled, his eyes grave. At last he spoke, each word falling heavy as a gavel strike. After reviewing the evidence, this court finds that Mrs. Elizabeth Krause is fully competent. Her decision to end financial support was reasonable and within her rights. The petition for guardianship is denied. Elizabeth closed her eyes as tears filled them, but they were not tears of weakness. They were tears of release, of victory. She had won, not only in the court, but in her life. Outside, midday sunlight poured through the tall windows, illuminating her path. For the first time in many years, Elizabeth Krause felt the warmth of a new beginning. A new chapter had opened, and this time it would be written by her own hand. When Judge Miller's gavel struck, the courtroom seemed to explode with noise, papers rustling, whispers swelling, benches creaking. But for Elizabeth Krause, everything turned still. She sat frozen in her chair, her hands trembling slightly, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. Yet these were not the bitter tears of humiliation she had so often swallowed in silence. These were tears of release, of a prisoner finally freed from captivity. Slowly, she turned toward her lawyer Schneider and gave him a small nod of gratitude. He responded with a kind, steady smile, pride glowing in his gaze. Elizabeth had fought, and Elizabeth had won. Across the aisle, Daniel and Clara sat stunned, their performance in tatters. Daniel's face flushed crimson, his lips pressed together until they nearly disappeared, his eyes sharp with anger he could not conceal. Clara's gaze dropped to the floor, her mouth twisted with resentment that bled through the mask of sorrow she had tried to paint. When they left the courtroom together, they did not look back once at Elizabeth. She knew then, with cold clarity, that whatever bond had once connected them had been shattered. In their hearts there remained no affection, only bitterness and hatred. Yet Elizabeth felt no pain. The truth had finally been revealed, and in that truth she found freedom. Returning home, she unlocked her door and stepped inside, pausing to breathe deeply. The air felt fresher, the walls lighter, as though the house itself sighed in relief. She moved slowly through the living room, her eyes catching on every corner, every memory. Here Daniel had once slammed his fist on her table. There Clara had wept false tears while demanding money. At that very spot, Lawyer Vogel had placed papers meant to strip her of control. But now, she thought, it all belonged entirely to her. No more intrusions, no more chains. This was her sanctuary again. The next morning she rose early, brewed her tea, and sat by the window as the first rays of sunlight painted the horizon. She opened her notebook, the pages crisp and empty, waiting. Carefully, she began to write a list. Enroll in an art class, purchase a ticket to Italy, visit her younger sister in Chicago, donate to a fund supporting elderly victims of abuse. Each line she wrote felt like a milestone hammered into the path of a new journey she had only just begun. Within a week, Elizabeth visited a real estate office. She signed away the old house with its heavy memories and used the funds to rent a bright apartment near the city center. The new place had a wide balcony overlooking a park filled with trees that rustled in the breeze. When she moved in, carrying only the belongings she chose for herself, she felt like a bird freed from a cage too small. No longer were there footsteps of Daniel rummaging through her drawers, no longer Clara lounging across her sofa as if it were her throne. Now there was only Elizabeth, alone, unburdened, and free. She began to live the life she had once denied herself. Every Saturday morning she attended a watercolor class. At first, the brush quivered in her hand, hesitant, but soon colors blossomed across the paper. Skies, rolling fields, wildflowers bursting into life. With each painting, a piece of her spirit returned, pieces that had been eroded by years of sacrifice. Her young teacher smiled at her progress and often said, "You have a gift for color. You paint with your heart." Elizabeth would smile in return, a warmth spreading through her chest. For the first time in decades, she felt seen. A month later, she boarded a plane bound for Italy. When she stepped into Venice, sunlight glittering across the canals, she wept openly, uncaring who saw. For years, she had believed this dream unreachable, a luxury never meant for her. Yet here she was, walking the winding streets, hearing voices rise in song from gondolas, her heart lifting like that of a girl again. In Florence, she stood in the great square and bought a notebook. On its first page, she wrote with a firm hand, "I came here by myself, not dependent on anyone, only through my own strength." When she returned home, Elizabeth donated part of her money to an organization that supported elderly people exploited by their families. At a community meeting, she stood and told her story. Her voice trembled at first, but her eyes burned with fire. Many in the audience wept. Some reached for her hands, calling her an inspiration. In that moment, Elizabeth realized her suffering had not been wasted. It had become a lantern to light the path for others. Daniel and Clara disappeared from her life. Rumors spread that they had been forced to move into a smaller apartment, that Clara had taken a job for the first time in years. Elizabeth listened with calm detachment. She felt no triumph, no regret. It was simply the consequence of their choices. Perhaps hardship would finally teach them lessons her generosity never had. Often in the evenings, Elizabeth sat on her balcony beneath the stars. She thought of her late husband and the vow she had whispered to him on his deathbed, that she would raise their son into a good man. She had given all she had to keep that promise. Yet in the end, she understood something even more vital, that she must also learn to love herself. One night, as a cool breeze drifted through the trees, Elizabeth lifted her cup of tea and whispered aloud, "I am old, but it is never too late to begin again." Her eyes gleamed with quiet conviction. She knew life ahead would not be simple. There would be trials, there would be battles. But this time she would walk forward not for Daniel, not for Clara, not for anyone else. She would walk forward for herself. At 72 years old, Elizabeth Krauss finally understood a truth that would never fade. Real love cannot be purchased with money, and freedom is a treasure that no cost can outweigh. There are wounds we cannot see with the eyes, yet they burn quietly in the heart and leave scars no one else can measure. For 3 long years, Elizabeth Krauss endured such wounds. She was belittled, taken advantage of, and treated by her own son and daughter-in-law as nothing more than a wallet with legs. Every sacrifice she made, every dollar she gave, was dismissed as if it were owed. When she finally refused to bend, they tried to strip her of dignity itself. But Elizabeth found the courage to rise. She cut the chains that bound her. She faced the courtroom, and she prevailed. Her victory was not just a legal one. It was the triumph of her spirit, the reclaiming of her freedom, and the moment she declared she would never again live as a victim. In that moment, she reminded us all that dignity is worth defending, and self-love is the strongest protection of all. Her story carries a message for each of us. True love cannot be bought with money, and blind sacrifice will never create happiness. We have the right to say enough, to draw boundaries, and to live for ourselves. Elizabeth proved that it is never too late to begin again, to choose freedom instead of chains, to rediscover one's own worth. If you have ever felt dismissed or used, remember that you are not alone. Millions of people face the same silent battles, and perhaps this story will light the spark of strength within you. Tell us, if you were in Elizabeth's place, what would you have done? Share your thoughts in the comments, and do not forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. And if someone you know needs to hear this, share it today, because one story can change a life.